There is a particular kind of strategic blindness that afflicts those who have spent too long reading press releases rather than logistics tables. It manifests as an obsession with territory, with lines on maps, with village names, with dramatic announcements of advance or retreat, while remaining entirely indifferent to the mundane, grinding, industrial realities that actually determine the outcome of modern war. Western commentary on the conflict in Ukraine has suffered from this blindness since the first days of the large scale invasion. But now, in the summer of 2025, the consequences of that blindness are becoming impossible to ignore, even for those most committed to ignoring them. What is happening to Russia's position in Crimea and the southern theater is not, as the more excitable corners of the internet would have it, a sudden dramatic reversal. It is the predictable, mathematically inevitable result of a sustained campaign against the physical infrastructure that makes military occupation possible. Ukraine has not discovered some miraculous weapon. It has not achieved some sudden breakthrough in battlefield technology. What it has done, methodically, patiently, at considerable cost, is identify the structural vulnerabilities of an extended Russian military posture and begin the systematic work of collapsing them. That work is now visibly accelerating, and the implications extend far beyond the borders of the peninsula itself. Let us begin with the physical geography, because geography is not merely a backdrop to military operations, it is their determinant. Crimea is a peninsula. That word, so familiar it has lost its meaning, describes a landmass connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of territory and otherwise surrounded by water. For a military force occupying that peninsula, this creates an inescapable logistical reality. Supply must flow through choke points. There is no alternative. You cannot spread your supply lines across open steppe when your supply lines must, by the nature of the terrain, funnel through specific, identifiable, targetable corridors. Russia has two primary means of supplying its forces in Crimea. The first is the Kerch Bridge, the large fixed crossing that connects the peninsula to the Russian mainland across the strait. That bridge has been struck repeatedly. Its capacity to bear heavy military traffic has been materially degraded. This is not speculation. It is the assessment of anyone who has examined the documented damage and applied elementary structural engineering reasoning to the question. The bridge still stands, and it still carries some traffic, but it is no longer the robust, high-capacity artery it was designed to be. The Russians know this. They plan around it. And that planning has forced an increasing dependence on the second corridor. The second corridor is the land route, the strip of territory running along the northern coast of the Sea of Azov that was seized in 2022 to create a continuous land connection between Russia and Crimea. This was, from a Russian operational planning perspective, one of the primary strategic objectives of the early phase of the large-scale invasion. Without it, the occupation of Crimea becomes logistically precarious. With it, the peninsula can theoretically be sustained indefinitely. The Russians understood this. They paid significant blood and operational capital to establish it, and they were right to consider it strategically vital, which is precisely why its progressive interdiction by Ukrainian strike systems represents something far more significant than a tactical nuisance.
Ukrainian medium-range strike drones, what is increasingly being described in operational discussions as mid-strike capability, systems operating at ranges of 100 to 200 kilometers, have matured into a genuinely effective interdiction force. This did not happen overnight. It happened through iterative development, through the absorption of combat lessons, through industrial scaling that many Western analysts continued to dismiss as insufficient long after it had become operationally significant. The result is a force that can now reach the land corridor along the Azov coast with sufficient regularity and lethality to make that corridor genuinely dangerous for the heavy truck convoys upon which Russian logistics in the south depend. Consider what this means in practical terms. A military force in the field requires continuous resupply. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, replacement equipment, spare parts. The list is not exotic. It is the same list that has determined the outcome of every sustained military campaign
in the history of organized warfare. The industrial age did not change this fundamental reality. It merely increased the quantities involved and the complexity of the supply chains required to meet them. Modern mechanized warfare is, at its logistical base, an extraordinarily hungry enterprise. Vehicles break down, artillery pieces wear out, ammunition is expended at rates that consistently surprise those who have not studied the historical data carefully. A military force that cannot reliably receive resupply cannot sustain combat operations. This is not a doctrinal position. It is a physical constraint.
What Ukraine has achieved in the southern theater is the progressive degradation of Russia's ability to meet this constraint for its forces in Crimea and the adjacent occupied territories. The land corridor is under attack. Truck convoys face the persistent threat of drone strike. Logistics nodes, the marshalling yards, the fuel depots, the ammunition storage facilities that form the backbone of any sustained military campaign are within range of Ukrainian strike systems and are being targeted with increasing sophistication. The cumulative effect of this campaign is not dramatic in any single day's reporting. It does not produce the kind of imagery that dominates news cycles, but it is, in the language of military analysis, operationally decisive in its direction, even if the timeline of its full effect remains uncertain.
There is a concept in military doctrine called battlefield air interdiction. The use of air power, or in the contemporary Ukrainian context, drone strike capability, to attack targets well behind the forward line of troops. The purpose is not to kill soldiers at the front. The purpose is to destroy the system that sustains those soldiers, the roads they depend on, the vehicles that carry their supplies, the facilities where those supplies are stored and processed. Classical air interdiction campaigns, the Allied operations against German logistics in the Second World War, the operations against North Korean and Chinese supply lines during the Korean War, demonstrated that this approach, sustained over sufficient time and conducted with sufficient intensity, can fundamentally alter the operational capacity of even a determined enemy force.
Ukraine, working with the tools available to it, is now conducting a version of this campaign using drone technology rather than manned aircraft. The strategic logic is identical. The operational effects, while slower to accumulate, are following a recognizable pattern. The isolation of Crimea as a strategic objective is not a recent Ukrainian innovation. It has been implicit in Ukrainian military planning since the peninsula was first occupied in 2014, but it has only become operationally feasible with the development of Ukrainian strike capabilities to the point where the choke points can be persistently threatened. The peninsula has three viable entry and exit routes: the Kerch Bridge, the land corridor along the Azov coast, and the sea lanes of the Black Sea. The Black Sea option has been effectively neutralized, not through any single dramatic naval engagement, but through the sustained Ukrainian campaign against the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which has driven that fleet from its primary operating areas and made sea transport to Crimea an enterprise of considerable risk. Two of the three corridors are therefore substantially degraded. The third, the land route, is under intensifying attack. This is what isolation looks like in its early stages. Not a dramatic siege, not a sudden cutoff, a progressive tightening of the constraints under which the occupying force must operate. The defenders of any occupied territory can sustain their position as long as they can receive the inputs required for continued resistance. Remove those inputs, systematically, persistently, at scale, and the mathematics of attrition begin to work against the occupier, regardless of the tactical skill or operational determination of individual units. Russian forces in Crimea are not composed of cowards or incompetents. The problems they face are not primarily problems of individual military quality. They are problems of systemic supply, of being at the end of a long, increasingly threatened logistical chain, in a theater where the enemy has developed the capability to attack that chain at multiple points simultaneously.
Now extend this analysis outward, because the significance of what is happening in the south is not contained within the borders of Crimea or even the adjacent occupied territories. It connects to a broader pattern of Russian strategic difficulty that has been developing throughout the conflict and is now becoming impossible to paper over with optimistic reporting about tactical advances elsewhere.
Russian offensive operations throughout the theater have continued to generate casualties at rates that any serious analysis of their manpower reserves must regard with concern. The territorial gains achieved through these operations have been, measured against the costs, operationally marginal. Advances of a few kilometers in contested areas of the Donbas, purchased at the cost of equipment losses and personnel casualties, that Russian industrial and demographic capacity can sustain only under increasingly adverse conditions, this is not the profile of a military campaign building toward decisive strategic outcome. It is the profile of a military campaign consuming itself in pursuit of objectives whose strategic value does not justify the cost of their acquisition. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian campaign against Russian oil and gas infrastructure, the longer-range strikes at refineries, at pipeline facilities, at the energy export apparatus that funds Russian military expenditure, represents a second axis of strategic pressure, operating on a different timeline, but with potentially more fundamental consequences. Oil and gas revenue does not simply pay for Russian military operations in some abstract accounting sense. It is the material basis of Russia's ability to sustain the conflict economically. Degrade that revenue stream sufficiently, over sufficient time, and you alter the fundamental calculus of what the Russian state can afford to do militarily. This is not a short-term effect. It will not produce a dramatic collapse in any single news cycle. But it is real, it is measurable in export data and refinery output statistics, and it compounds over time. The drone campaign against Russian training facilities in the occupied territories represents a third dimension of pressure, one whose significance is perhaps least appreciated in mainstream discussion. Military units require training to maintain and develop combat effectiveness. Recruits require instruction before they can be employed usefully in complex operations. Training infrastructure, the ranges, the facilities, the cadres of experienced soldiers capable of transmitting skills and doctrine to new personnel, is not infinitely replicable. It exists in specific places. Those places can be identified and targeted. When training facilities are struck with sufficient regularity, the pipeline of prepared military personnel that a force requires for sustained operations begins to thin. Units that might have been trained to a reasonable standard of competence before deployment arrive at the front with less preparation than their commanders had planned for. The degradation is gradual. It is difficult to quantify in real time, but it is operationally real, and it accumulates. What emerges from examination of these multiple simultaneous pressures is not the picture that either the most optimistic or most pessimistic observers of this conflict tend to present. It is not a picture of imminent Russian collapse. The Russian state retains substantial resources, substantial capacity for adaptation, and a leadership structure that has demonstrated it will accept very high costs in pursuit of its strategic objectives. But it is also not a picture of sustainable Russian advantage. It is a picture of a military campaign that is consuming Russian capacity at rates that the underlying industrial and demographic base cannot indefinitely absorb, while simultaneously being subjected to an increasingly sophisticated Ukrainian interdiction campaign that is degrading the logistical infrastructure upon which continued Russian operations depend. The question that serious analysts must ask is not whether Ukraine can produce some dramatic battlefield reversal in the near term. The conditions for that kind of rapid movement do not currently exist. The question is whether the rate at which Russian capacity is being degraded across all dimensions simultaneously can be sustained long enough to cross the threshold at which Russian strategic calculus changes. That threshold is not knowable in advance. It depends on factors: internal Russian politics, the actual state of Russian economic reserves, the true condition of Russian military manpower, that are not fully transparent to outside observers. But the direction of movement is increasingly clear, and the instruments of that movement are increasingly effective. The position of Western governments in this context deserves a separate and uncomfortable examination. The reduction of American commitment to European security, the scaling back of exercises, the uncertainty over rotational force deployments, the withdrawal from active diplomatic leadership on the conflict, does not occur in a strategic vacuum. It is observed, it is assessed
by Russia, by China, by every state that is watching to determine whether the alliance structures that have organized Western security since 1945 are undergoing fundamental revision or merely temporary turbulence. The signals being sent are not ambiguous, regardless of how the officials generating them choose to characterize them. When 1,000 troops complete a deployment and their replacement is uncertain, that uncertainty is itself a strategic signal.
When naval exercises are reduced in scope due to resource pressures, the reduction is noted by every naval intelligence service with an interest in Baltic security. The architecture of deterrence is not maintained by declarations. It is maintained by presence, by demonstrated capability, by the consistent behavior of reliable allies. Remove those demonstrations and the architecture begins to degrade, not immediately, not dramatically, but progressively and in ways that become increasingly difficult to reverse.
What the situation in the southern theater of Ukraine illustrates ultimately is a strategic principle that has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout military history, but continues to be poorly understood by those who confuse tactical spectacle with operational meaning. That the outcome of sustained industrial warfare is determined not by the drama of individual engagements, but by the systematic management of capacity, one's own and one's enemies. Ukraine has learned this lesson under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. It is applying it with increasing sophistication. The results are visible in the progressive degradation of Russian logistical capacity in the south, in the growing isolation of Crimea as a sustainable military position, in the compound effects of simultaneous pressure across multiple dimensions of Russian operational capacity. Whether that application of strategic pressure will be sufficient and on what timeline, those questions remain genuinely open. But the direction is not open. The direction is being determined by the same forces that have always determined the direction of sustained military conflict: industrial capacity, logistical reach, the ability to sustain rates of attrition that the enemy cannot match. On those dimensions, the picture in the summer of 2025 looks measurably different from the picture of 12 months ago. And it looks different in ways that compound, not in ways that plateau. That is the assessment that the logistics tables provide when you read them carefully, and when you resist the temptation to mistake the noise of daily tactical reporting for the signal of strategic movement. The Kerch Bridge will face further pressure. The land corridor will face further interdiction. The Black Sea Fleet's operational capacity will continue to decline. And somewhere in that progressive accumulation of logistical constraint, the mathematics of occupation will become impossible to sustain. When that calculation tips, not if, but when, and not dramatically, but through the quiet grinding logic of supply chain arithmetic, the strategic map of the southern theater will change in ways that will appear sudden only to those who were not watching the logistics. Those who were watching already understand what is happening. The rest will be surprised.